So essentially what we're saying here is I wrote a tweet about, well, whenever that was, the 8th of March. So what's that, 12 days back, essentially saying, here's how I think we might use my data for the next virus. Right? So I was essentially assuming COVID-20, because back only 12 days ago, things were bad, but not terrible, certainly not in the UK and certainly not in Scotland. So I was hypothesizing as to how things would be better if we had bottom-up data. And the thing that triggered me to post was this tweet from Doc Searles, who many of you will know. He might be joining, he might not be, I'm not sure. Essentially where he's saying, in this kind of situation, the market for bullshit drops to zero, right? So we need accurate data. The things that we might tolerate under normal conditions are no longer remotely relevant or remotely interesting. In fact, they're downright unhelpful. I think the later session talks about that unhelpful side of things. So my tweet essentially said, how about if we put this kind of capability in place? And obviously I was coming from a JLINC perspective because I've been working on that with John and others for 3 years or so. So my theory, as it was at the time, as to what one would need to bring bottom-up data into the mix. So really what I'm saying is top-down data can only be as good as it can be, right? The government, the health service, all those folks are basically watching the population through a set of binoculars, right? And if they say 395 people have got it in Scotland and 14 have died, well, you couldn't, you wouldn't name those, and you certainly wouldn't name anyone in the projections because they don't know, right? They certainly don't know anything about the projections.
Ian, just one kind of request. Can you put the presentation mode to be able that the people can actually see better? Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yep. Does that work?
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So top-down data can only be as good as it can be, and there's various ways you can augment that with more. With more surveillance, right? You can ratchet up Google searches and Facebook searches and whatever. But you can never.
Ian, quickly, can I record this? Is that okay?
I think it's being recorded anyway, Doc. So.
Okay, good. All right, fine.
It's being recorded. It will be available next week. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I just mentioned your tweet, Doc, that got me thinking about the market for bullshit is now zero. In fact, it's probably negative now. So, as I say, top down can only give you so much, and that will be ratcheted up over the next weeks and months with all sorts of surveillance mechanisms. But it still can't tell you what the individual can tell you. So right now I can tell you there's 2 people have the virus right, in my immediate area. I know who they are, I know what state they're in, I probably know where they got it, or I suspect I know where they got it. And if that was useful, they and me and others could float that data up to be blended with the top-down stuff and hopefully produce something useful. So that remained theoretical at that point in time. My post was talking about what would one need to bring about this bottom-up data. So one would want to have decentralized identity. So you're not building huge central databases. You would want the data to be volunteered, right? So it's not being dragged from the individual, it's voluntarily on a win-win basis. You would like something that I'm calling algorithms or personal algorithms that I engage to help me for my purposes. Ideally, you would have a data commons or a trust, right? So that if I throw data over the fence, I don't need to give it a whole lot of thought because it's very clearly a trusted entity put together for a particular purpose with the relevant skills. And just in case I didn't trust it, I would want a full audit log of what I had shared with whatever party in order to try and make things happen. And the overlay for that is privacy by design, which to me is always more a kind of theoretical concept, or certainly has been corporate world. But if you're doing bottom-up stuff, you really want privacy by design as a must-have. So that was all 12 days back, and then over the last day or two, when things have got a bit more real, I've added you would also want that data set to be able to evolve and reconfigure in almost real time. And Paul Olivier is going to talk more about how the information needs change very, very quickly. So that was all fine 12 days back. And I was thinking about JLINC clearly, because that's what I work on, which essentially is about data owners can pass data backwards and forwards between themselves and service providers. It's clean data, it's trustworthy data. I won't dwell on that because I'll send the slides after that. And essentially JLINC is about an A service that's typically for individuals and a B service that's typically for organizations. Both parties sign up to agreements to move data backwards and forwards in real time. And it's all in an open protocol, and it's all where things are certainly headed. And I was still assuming down the track. At that point, things then took a little bit of a different turn. I think, I can't even remember how the conversation started, but with Paul Olivier piped up on Slack, I think it was, that said, is there anything we could do with this now? And if not now, next week, or 10 days after that, or any time after that. And clearly things were becoming much more real as each day unfolded. So we then changed mode, and Paul Olivier and I have been collaborating just to say, okay, that prototype I had put screenshots on the blog post was real. It was pretty much a production thing, but it was clearly just, in my eyes, a proof of concept. Paul Olivier, if you're there, do you want to chip in on your own thoughts on how to how that?
I have the baby here, but I've tried to understand very much the dynamics of the epidemic, the maths and all of that, and to follow like the cutting edge research to try to understand the global needs or the needs in my community. And progressively, I came to the conclusion that some form of data collectives are needed to collect crowdsourced information at some point in this epidemic. And so that makes the MyData approach a very, very natural thing. Because all kinds of dimensions of an individual's personal life, not just their health, will become a very important matter in handling this epidemic. So I hope to explain that in the next section. But there is, I urgently start to feel a need here for an approach like this. And I think even governments are not quite ready for that type of approach.
Yeah, and I think what we've or to be more accurate, Paul Olivier has dug into the maths as to what data becomes relevant to which country or which locality at which point in time, which led to us recognizing that one can change these questions that are asked of individuals, more or less real time. So I'll show you now just some screenshots, and then I can show you the live system. My start point was the JLINC sandbox, which I think many of you have seen before, which essentially, so JLINC is a protocol, as I said, for moving data backwards and forwards between any entities, toasters and fridges or whatever. This particular instantiation is about me and my suppliers. So that literally is my suppliers that's on that list there. So that was the start point, worked with the existing sandbox. We then went backwards and forwards and said, okay, what questions would one ask? Building on the ones I had put in the blog post, which was really just about contact risk, geographic risk, existing health scenarios. And then Paul Olivier had essentially tightened those up and were becoming more focused. Do you think you have the illness? Do you think you have had the illness and are recovering? Do you know you've not had it, etc.? Would you be willing to get involved in a focus group? So this, what you're seeing on the screen here is the JLINC B service, where the organization, whether that be Data Commons or something else, comes in and just said, we wish to gather this data, we wish to co-manage this data backwards and forwards with our collective, whoever that collective might be. they then send an invite by email or SMS or whatever. So what you're now seeing on the screen is the A service, so the service for the individual. So in this screen, you're really just saying, I have the option to fill in some numbers or some scores. And the fact that that slider is blue and to the right means that I am sharing those scores with the COVID-19 Switzerland data commons. What you're seeing down here in the bottom left is the audit trail, which it's not accurate right now, but it is working. The audit trail that basically says I have shared this data with that entity at this point in time. So the whole thing is tracked with the connection back to my decentralized identifier. And over here, final slide, essentially is back on the B service, where I can now start to see and use and pass on to other services the different scores that I'm getting back from the individual. So what we're really saying here is we have something that's extremely early for a right here, right now scenario, but we believe it's architecturally sound in that the big picture of the architecture is as it needs to be, MyData, passing data with permission under control to whoever it needs to get it on a volunteer basis. Where that takes us, when we've got the live system, let me just,
Well, while Ian is bringing up the live system.
Yep, fire away, John.
Just going to say that depending on the hooks that we build into it and the agreements, you also have the possibility, one of the things that's important in COVID-19 is contact tracing. So one possible use case is to hook up the A server, which is the Alice side of the server, to your phone and your location ID, which is everybody knows is highly sensitive, but that gives you a contact map that should you be determined to be positive, could be made available to medical authorities under the appropriate warrant or legal authority to not even necessarily share your identity, but here's someone who's self-identified as COVID positive, and here's their location track for contact tracing. So by maintaining the control on the user side, you're able to share things for the social good and still maintain control without having to necessarily throw the data over the fence and then have somebody 6 months down the road say, well, we've got all this data, why don't we do this other thing with it? So to Ian's point about the data commons, one of the things you could do in setting this up as a data commons is saying, well, this is an emergency data commons, we're going to use it for 6 months. And then when we determine COVID-19 has become endemic or disappeared, we're going to delete all the data. Done deal. So those are the kinds of possibilities when you maintain the control.
So, right, so that's part of the idea that I'll talk about myself. And you can also imagine much more complex situations where you do joint computations. No data is actually exchanged that is not encrypted, for instance, and decipherable by the other side. So you can very much complexify the exchange of data from there.
Is Ian trying to talk?
You're on mute, Ian.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, what I was saying is what I can show on the live system that you couldn't see on the PowerPoint was the information sharing agreement. So essentially what JLINC does is just says party A wishes to share this data with party B under this agreement. And by the way, we're going to write that all to an audit log. So what you're seeing here is the information sharing agreement. We only have one at the moment. John wrote it. It's largely GDPR based. It's commercially sound, favours the individual. But we suspect if you wanted to go do something really, really urgently, you'd only have this option. But for this use case, we'd be more likely to try and build a new one that would work particularly for this emergency situation. So what you're seeing here is the B server, the B service. If we find tomorrow a particularly new data attribute shows up like your temperature. To learn to spell. Yeah, I just add that. And that will then appear over on the A service, which I'm looking at here, as it will be there somewhere. Another one of these attributes that are under my control, or if my contact risk goes up and somebody comes into my house that's positive, that goes up from 30 to 90, and I just save that. So does that all make sense?
Yeah, it looks.
Is everybody clear when we talk about A server and B server, what that means and what that's reflected in the interface?
Yeah, and I have a question. So first of all, it's really great work, and to be so responsive, Ian, for you and Paul Olivier. Let me play devil's advocate, which is now the trust, right? So if I want to be a biohacker, I am going to show that I'm okay. I'm going to share that I'm okay. But I'm going to make sure I'm infectious, but I'm going to share that I'm okay, and I'm going to put that into a public space. So obviously that's an extreme case. If somebody shares that they are infected and are not, well, then that's not such a risk. It's the other way around. So it's the chicken and egg problem we always have in terms of the trust factor. So have you guys been discussing that at all? Because anything that's self-asserted will be gamed. It's human nature. Humans love to do that. And it might be gamed for good, but typically it's gamed for bad. So have you thought about how there's a validation layer, a verification layer, a monitoring layer, so that the source can also be trusted?
So can I unpack that for a bit? Because I've been thinking about the information sharing agreement that might be appropriate here. It's a 2 or 3 sided problem. So you're absolutely right, Katrina. Self-asserted data is as good as the assertion. So when I print a business card, you take it with a grain of salt. On the other hand, depending on the complexity, and Paul Olivier probably has a lot to say about this, if I have access to a medical device from my doctor or my health supplier, if I have IoT devices like a withing scale or a thermometer or things like that, those would have a higher level of assurance and feed into the data with some level of provenance. For this data element is self-asserted. This is asserted by a device. This is asserted by a medical provider. In an emergency situation, I'm not sure how much complexity we can build in. And from a population basis and population analysis, self-assertions may get you 80% of the way for public health authorities to respond. But I take your point. Yes, we've been thinking about that.
Yeah, thinking about it, not built at this point in time.
Yeah.
I'll also say the 2-sided problem is, for this to be viable and uptake, it's not enough for the individuals to participate. The health authorities or the public authorities will want to be able to trust the database and use it themselves. So there needs to be agreements or terms on on that side of the B server consumer to ensure that the assurances we provide to them that about the validity of the data match the levels of assurances getting from the users.
I think this is one of the chicken and egg problems, and I saw a note from Paul Olivier in terms of, if we don't find a way to solve it bottom up, we'll find top down. And you look at somewhere like Singapore right now that's managing things incredibly well, but there's a carrot and a stick. People are self-asserting and people are checking in, but there are also a layer of checks and measures, and I'm not advocating for that at all because it's very paternalistic, but Someone could knock on your door at any moment. Someone could query the temperature check. There are fines. In Australia, if I went home right now, if I leave my house, if I was able to go home and I left my house, there's a $20,000 fine for leaving my house in the first 14 days of arriving back in the country. So, and I'm not advocating for you know, some sort of punishment system, but what I'm saying is that this verified trust layer or consequence layer, we have to try and find a way to get this in, because I think the Bob Alice thing, we're getting closer and closer to being able to solve that. It's almost this governance layer that is our next frontier, to try and work out how we do that without repercussion towards someone. Because again, you know, humans get away with whatever they can get away with, and if there aren't consequences moderated by the system, then people will just do what they can.
But doesn't that take us back to Doc's original tweet?
Well, I think it's more subtle than that. I mean, the Katrina makes valid points. The situation is pretty dire. In Switzerland, from an electronics a data standpoint, the cases last week were reported by fax to the central authorities. That was the procedure. They had to report data. Now, they've basically, this week, they've decided to stop reporting because they are just unable to cope. So this is from the nature of this epidemic is that you can fight it better with data. And in Switzerland, at least, there is no data infrastructure. There is no sufficiently good data infrastructure. So there is a lot of civic hackers that can build infrastructure quickly, but there will be a lot of problems around the governance layer that you just mentioned, Katrina. So the usefulness of JLINC in particular, maybe other solutions as well, but that I see is that it enables taking care of all the legal aspects. There needs to be another layer that you are pointing at of ethics. And then as input on the A side, you can build quick apps that basically just connect with JLINC. That's the way I see it, as a pipe that has a legal and an ethical aspect to it.
Yeah. I think if you can get Bob Alice and some sort of governance / verification / monitoring party in, then I think it goes a long way to starting to solve things. Yeah.
I think that's Katrina. I think that's right. I mean, and to Paul's point about complexity, what you identified in Singapore has high levels of social trust. That's not true in a lot of countries. So you try the top down, which is working in Singapore and Hong Kong, and South Korea has good reports as well, but they all have relatively high levels of social trust at one level or another. But if you tried the same thing in other countries, what you'd end up with is a lot more of what you discussed in terms of data hiding, obfuscation, lying, and gaming. So the solution, there is no one size fits all here, which is why the bottom up part on the Alice side needs levels of, if this goes beyond a couple of weeks in an emergency response, there'll be iterations on this to build levels of assurance, and on the B side, levels of governance. And if you've seen some of the slides from Verified Credentials or Sovereign on the on how data is verified by trusted third parties, I think adding that into the mix for the ecosystem is where I'd probably see this going as an architecture.
Yeah, which is right, but we've got the decentralized ID in that mix, and the ability to pass verified claims as and when they're ready.
Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to have this session was
something out the door quickly, though, is critical to provide options to people.
So the reason we wanted to have this session was essentially, does this make sense? Should we try and do something with this quickly, right? Or would that be pointless? And let's try and do it for the next one.
And speaking for myself, I would also take this as an open call for any company, organization, or tech person to participate in this. I mean, Ian and I are part of JLINC, but in no way, shape, or form do we look at this as a revenue or market opportunity for JLINC. It's more of a social obligation to bring our skills for the common good. So
Yeah.
any other organization or tech person who wants to participate, please do. And JLINC.org, which is the protocol is open. So.
Any questions for now? I mean, I know Paul Livy is running another session later on, more on the mathematical side of things, which I think gets into what data is going to be most relevant at which point of the curve.
Well, there were Ian. There were two things on the chat. Well, one was from Vladimir. He would like to ask if you could share your slides. And there was also, I think, from Doc Sears, more a comment than I think a question. I don't know if you see it. That was at like 20 minutes before. I don't know if you addressed that. Maybe. Is there our colleague Doc Sears with us? Do you want to comment?
Okay, I'm off mute. That's good.
Yeah.
It was actually a UI consideration in in response to the question Ian had about whether this is clear to people. I think it's and this is just a UI thing that that JLINC can iterate. I think it needs to be clear to how A and B look and feel different. In other words, that, you know, I'm over here or I'm over there.
Yeah.
Use different colors, use different images. There is no, unfortunately, there is no really good image for I'm an individual, except maybe a men's or a ladies' room symbol. You know, there just isn't. And for an organization, it could be you know, like a little building or something like that. But I think that needs to be made clearer. The other thing is I was saying a kind of an amen to what Katrina was saying about the peculiar environment we're in right now, which is kind of where a lot of us are under martial law, essentially. And we're in a world where, in many ways, the top-down centralized systems that we've been fighting against and trying to replace for a long time are suddenly called into service, and we're relying on them. And privacy is being thrown out the window, a lot of other things being thrown out the window. And I think there is, however, a really unique opportunity here for JLINC to step forward and be the first exemplar of the individual being the first party, the individual being the one to take the first move in agreements, in control over how data gets sent or distributed and used, and having an audit trail and a record and all of that. This is the simplest way I've seen it put, and I just think there's a real good opportunity there. But we have to be mindful of the kind of environment that Katrina was describing, because I think it's an important consideration.
Yeah.
Can I just add, because it's really important for the whole MyData community, the WHO guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines on the use of data during epidemiological events, are that individuals have a moral obligation to contribute to surveillance.
Wow.
Which is very strong, but this has been very thought through. And if you parse what that means, it just means logging data and computing on it. It doesn't mean losing privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me also add to that those are medical personnel. And in a medical context, because I do a fair bit of work in the health, surveillance means something completely different than what you just heard, Doc.
Right.
Surveillance is what's the data so I know what's going on.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have a moral obligation to contribute if the purpose is to have a complete data set, for instance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you know the denominator in your computations, so you know that some people are not infected, for instance.
Yeah. So this is I would in our more general conversations I would say medical or health surveillance to distinguish it between where people's heads are going to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can I just, sorry for
this is the opportunity for MyData to show a different model based on consent in that context. That's it.
Thank you. Maybe, I mean, we have to finish this discussion, but or smoothly move to the next discussion of disinformation, misinformation, and trust in a pandemic. Can you maybe point people where the discussion continues, where they can actually reach out to you? Is it the Slack channel Corona Data the best place to go? And yeah, how do we continue with this discussion?
So I'm going to post those slides in the Corona Data.
Okay, so I'm posting here for everyone who's new to us, and in the chat I'm posting the if you are on Slack, then find your way to the Corona Data channel. If you are completely new to Slack, find your way to Slack, mydata.org/Slack. You don't need any invitation, is open for everyone, so please join us there.